If you were to ask people what they believed the most powerful technology in the world might be, some, I think, would say nuclear weapons. Some might say the internet. Perhaps there's a few futurologists who are speculating that it's AI, artificial intelligence. But this morning, I would like to try to make the case for story as being the most powerful technology and one that we must understand if we want to build a better world. It is story that helps us understand ourselves as a people. It was story that created religion and nations and even how we think of space as somehow something. It is story that gives certain leaders the right to drop bombs on people while denying other leaders to drop bombs on the people bombing them. AI will be built on the story that we feed it. So we better feed it good stories. We're going to reap a whirlwind. According to a recent piece in the Washington Post, Amazon's Alexa has been claiming that the 2020 election was stolen because it's digesting stories circulating on the internet. I believe that story is everything, which might be a little self-serving, since really I'm just a glorified storyteller. But I believe that story is everything. It is the glue to our existence and perhaps even the pill leading to our demise. But too often we amble through life oblivious to the stories we are living within and are thus controlled by elements in these stories that we refuse to confront or even acknowledge. Why is our nation at odds when so many of us share the same problems? Why do people vote against their own material interests? Why are people angry about issues that don't affect their lives and are not angry about ones that do? It all depends on the story they are listening to. And this is true for all of us. Every human likes to believe that they arrived at the opinions and the positions that they hold rationally, consciously, intentionally, but more often than not, we arrived at the place we did because we agreed or disagreed with some story. And this doesn't mean that I believe that all stories are equal. A couple weeks ago, we talked about the path of life and the path of death, and some of these stories help us choose into greater life, while others send us deeper down the path of nihilism, towards the path of death. So it's important to understand the story we are living within, because you, me, we are living within some story. Many stories even. But let's take this weekend, for example. Tomorrow, many people in this nation will have a day off from work. It's one of the 4 federal holidays named for a human being. The other holidays are Washington's birthday, sometimes erroneously observed as President's Day, and Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, and Christmas Day, Jesus' birthday. The other remaining 7 holidays, and there are 11 total, observe pivotal moments or movements in our history. Independence Day, Thanksgiving, Memorial Day, and most recently, Juneteenth, for example. Holidays are used to tell our story. They remind us of what's important to the narrative as a nation. So just like the family stories we repeat over and over again to tell the future generations where we came from, I think of our holidays like stars in the sky between which lines are drawn and constellations. The word holiday comes to us from the Old English, I'm going to get it wrong, hāligdæg. I don't speak Old English, which means holy day. holiday comes from holy day. And each of the human beings named in the federal holidays sit in our national narrative. They sit on our national altar like saints watching over us. Some of them we are comfortable with. Some of them we are uncomfortable with. But they all tell part of the story. The facts of these men are often shaded to create meaning instead of staying true to history because we want them to represent values we see in ourselves or values that we aspire to. The facts don't always align with the values, so we change the story because the facts aren't actually as important as finding ourselves in the constellation of meaning. Christmas Day, Jesus' birthday, orients the nation within a Christian paradigm. This is the story of the God of the land. There are certain regions that have their own textures. In New York, for example, they have added to their narrative by giving school children days off for the Jewish high holy days. But these additional narratives are regional, right? With perhaps considerable influence, but they're not powerful enough to put those gods on the national altar. Not yet, anyway. Dr. King sits there as a redemptive saint, trying to save the soul of the nation from crimes committed during its founding and growth. His pastoral message, his prophetic message, his martyrdom mimic the story of the central God on the altar, but still, there are those who refuse to recognize his place among the saints. Indeed, in some places, they have avoided incorporating the story by calling the third Monday in January Civil Rights Day or Human Rights Day. In Alabama and Mississippi, they celebrate the holiday as Lee King Day in order to recognize the birthday of Robert E. Lee. I have a line here telling you who he is, but I think you know. Anyways, military commander of the Confederate forces, just in case. Incidentally, they got this idea from the state of Virginia. Yeah, I didn't know this. Which first began celebrating Lee Day in 1889, which was then changed to Lee Jackson Day because they wanted to add General Stonewall Jackson. Go Virginia. Virginia then changed to Lee Jackson King Day in 1985, which is not only a mouthful, it's just an absurdity on the highest level. It was only in the year 2000 that Virginia saw fit to split the men apart. MLK Day is recognized on the third Monday in January, and Lee Jackson Day was on the preceding Friday. And it was only in 2020 that Virginia finally got rid of the day on Earth. Yeah, that's my story. That's what I call him. Lee King Day, however, still exists in Alabama and Mississippi. Again, regional tribalism. Nationally, we recognize Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King among the saints. There's Washington, our Abraham, if you will, the father of the nation. Mostly our children are taught myths about his honesty and military prowess. There was no cherry tree, I hate to tell you. I know, there was no cherry tree. He also did not stand up in the boat when he was crossing the Delaware. Also not true, right? These are stories. And the facts are not actually that important when you're trying to tell a story. What's important is the story. And then there's Columbus. Oh, big sigh over there. The most controversial of the saints, right? Our Adam, if you will.
He is our creation story as a nation. And there are those who quibble about what they call textual inaccuracies in the Bible. And honestly, I don't know what to say to these people. The Bible is not a historical document. It is a creation story of a people. It's a story that talked about how a people came to be. That's all it is. And people orient themselves around stories to give meaning to their lives, and this is also true of Columbus. What we are taught is hardly history. It is hagiography. Oh, there we go. Hagiography, which is the study of the lives of the saints. There may be facts in which the general narrative hangs, right? And there are certainly facts that have been omitted so as to keep the national narrative unencumbered. I mean, no one likes to start the story of a people with a genocide. That's a very bad way to start a story. So there's been a lot of effort put into reimagining this holiday as something else. Most recently, we're calling it Indigenous Peoples Day. But the law has not yet changed, and there's a reason it has not yet changed, because we're still invested in part of that story. It has not yet changed, and there are those who see this reimagining as the tinny political correctness of Native Americans and so-called revisionist historians tarnishing the image of a hero, which is a bit ironic since Columbus Day is entirely revisionist in the first place. If we search for the meaning of Columbus Day, we need to look at the situations that brought this holiday about, what brought this holy day about. You know, the storybook that I had, which probably many of you had, told of a man motivated by great curiosity to explore beyond the boundaries of what was known. And he possessed fearlessness and great faith, values that we like to tell about ourselves to this day. And in this children's book that I had, his story finished with what seemed like a very unjust imprisonment by some very ungrateful monarchs in Spain. But his own journals and testimonies written against him by contemporaries indicate that he was actually imprisoned because of his great cruelty and avarice. You know, his willingness to torture and kill shocked even those who considered him a friend. And for centuries, he was actually disregarded. So why did the story of Columbus come back? The first known celebration of the arrival of the Europeans to what is now become known as the Americas was held on October 12, 1792 in New York City, marking the 300th anniversary of Columbus's landing. The very next day, October 13th, the cornerstone for the White House was laid in the newly named District of Columbia. The fledgling country was in search of new roots. The new Americans had fought a bitter war to separate from the mother country, and in attempting to differentiate themselves from the colonial masters, they reached deeply into the past to establish a new creation story, a new story of origin and founding. So it's not by chance that the capital of our nation, Washington, D.C., carries the name of both our first president and founding father, the man who established European dominion over the lands. The first Columbus Day did not begin until the late 1860s. There was some disagreement about whether it began in 1866 or 1869, but the celebration was led by Italians and Italian Americans who lifted up Columbus as evidence of their right to fully participate in American society. Some of you may have seen, or at least seen reference to signs like "No Italians, no Irish, no Jews need apply." These were the great unwashed masses of Europe. And today these signs seem anachronistic given the great umbrella of whiteness that now includes all Europeans and those of European descent. But this was not always the case, and it's important to think about this celebration in context of the day. If we assume the most conservative date, and let's take 1869, as the official start of Columbus Day, we see that only 4 years before, the United States had finished one of its bloodiest battles. And making it more painful was the fact that this so-called Civil War at times pitted family against family, brother against brother. At stake was the moral vision of the United States. Would we continue to enslave human beings because of the color of their skin? The victory of the North ended slavery, and we quickly added the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments to the Constitution, carving out a more inclusive understanding of citizenship, adding to our story. However, the destruction of the peculiar institution did not mean the destruction of white supremacy or the belief that white people were somehow either by God or science inherently better than people of color and people of African and indigenous descent in particular. But the country had been torn apart, and the power structure that kept Anglo-Saxon Protestants at the top was endangered. Italians, Irish, Jews, and other Europeans who had been previously excluded from the halls of power were offered a trade. We would assimilate. We would assimilate into Anglo-Saxon culture. We would give up our languages, give up our customs, engage in a forgetting of the past. And in return, we would support the notion of a new identity that had been growing over the past 200 years, the identity of the so-called white person. We were not Irish anymore. We were American. The concept of racial superiority had been around for a couple hundred years, but at that time it included a hierarchy amongst the so-called whites. And we still hear echoes of this today. Institutions like the Daughters of the American Revolution, or being able to trace your lineage to the Mayflower, do not just conjure up notions of legitimacy based on time in these shores, because people of African descent have been here just as long. They conjure up notions of purity, notions of time before we were mixed, before white people called ourselves mutts. What was created in the wake of the Civil War in an effort to rejoin a nation torn in half was a new identity, a broader understanding of the so-called white people, and Columbus Day was the suture used to close the wound. In some tribal regions, they added Lee and Jackson to the pantheon of white saints. But regardless of where we came from, the new white Americans could now reach back and claim our right to lead with Columbus as our touchstone. He was an Italian who delivered the Americas to Spain, a mutt in his own right. In 1937, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, following a traumatic series of events in U.S. history, made it a federal holiday. And in 1971, amidst our most recent expansion of civil rights, Columbus Day was moved to October 12th, to the second Monday of October. Whenever there is a serious threat to national identity or a movement that is creating national anxiety, the American Revolution, Civil War, the Great Depression, Civil Rights Movement, we have returned again and again to Columbus and Columbus Day as a way of unifying the culture around so-called white values and history. And this is not by chance. We may not be conscious of what's happening, but it's not by chance. And we may not like this Genesis story, but that's irrelevant, right? Columbus is a major constellation in the sky of meaning. Columbus was a horrible man. Indeed, so was Adam, right? And just like Adam, he raised Cain. And we have been murdering and colonizing one another ever since. This is part of our inheritance. And people have been writing commentary for centuries on the wives of Cain and Seth, two of the three children born to Adam and Eve. And they say things like, if God created only these humans, how did they find wives? Of course there were other people. They were simply erased from the creation story. And this is a type of colonialism. If you control the story, you are able to wipe other people out. Here in the Americas, there were other people. There are other people who still have to fight to keep their stories alive. But Columbus sits on the altar. And it's difficult to reframe the story because the existence of Europeans in the Americas kind of depends on him. By what authority do Europeans have to be here if Columbus was wrong? Perhaps we don't have any authority to be here. Which you can either be like, you figure that out for yourselves, but it often puts people into a corner and asks them to defend a man that perhaps we shouldn't. And so it goes in the United States. We are drawn to these extreme poles where a person defends one position at all costs while another rejects that position in its entirety. No solution can be found because there's no willingness to see ourselves in the other person's position, or more poignantly, to see that person and their vision in ourselves. But maybe there's a third way. One that's in between honoring Columbus and removing him from the altar entirely, a way initiated by our southern neighbors. In many Latin American countries, this day, holiday, holy day, is referred to as Dia de la Raza, or Day of the People, in recognition of the fact that a new identity was formed when Columbus arrived, like a meteor out of the sky, right? People who were not just European and not just indigenous, a mestizo people, people born out of great horror, but also great love, like the double helix of the DNA, the twin strains of aggression and affection that make up our identities in this hemisphere. We are the product of murder as well as love. Shadow sides and light sides. So personally, I am not in favor of forgetting Columbus, nor am I really in favor of honoring him. He is my shadow side, an essential part of the fire in which I was forged. And I never want to ignore my shadow. Wow, there's enough therapists in here to tell you what happens when you do that. Right? It overtakes you. Indeed, my shadow side can be more seductive than my light side. Right? One of the lesser gods, desire, works readily as its minion. But something must be done. Some accounting must be taken. There are people who've been ignored, who've been passed over, who've had little or no valuing of their lives, no meaning attributed to their loss and suffering. As a nation, there remains great pressure to continue, even to this day, to make these people into faceless beings, things even, so that we are not burdened by their story. And this cannot stand. But accounting for the lives and the loves of these people is not enough. There are ways to retell the Columbus story, but this is not enough. We must find ourselves in this Genesis story, acknowledge our ancestor, as complicated as he is, and discern our inheritance, all of us, each of us. We don't remove him from the story. How could we? Who would we be? Instead, we add to it. And we don't do this only by rewriting history books, by making living history as communities invested in healing the wounds created by the founding of these so-called people that we refer to as Americans. Many of you will have the day off tomorrow as a nation. And many of you will wrestle with what it means to honor Columbus. Some of us just push it away and we just take it as a day off, right? Because we don't know what to do with it. But don't turn away as if he doesn't matter. Indeed, he matters immensely, just as Adam matters to the biblical narrative. We must not be canonical, though. There are other people present in the biblical stories who've been erased, and there's nothing we can do about that, but we can ensure that that doesn't happen to our national story, to our creation story. We must assume responsibility for this Columbus story. If we abandon it, and I mean that in particular for us, we must assume responsibility for that Columbus story, because if we abandon it, other people will use it in ways that do not serve us and do not serve humanity. Be it as it may, there was a new people that was formed in this nation and on this continent, but the allurement and the promise of purity and supremacy has kept this nation chained to the worship of trauma. If we are to move as a moral community, if we say we stand for justice, if we stand for equality, there can be no greater question in our mind than how do we abolish the cult of whiteness and the allurement of purity? The killing that Columbus brought to the shores has not stopped, and it will not stop until those of us who are called white become traitors to the race, and whiteness is abolished. And the stories of those Americans who have been overlooked or oppressed have been raised up and incorporated into our story as well. This is who we are. And there is support for this, perhaps more support than we have ever seen before, which is one of the reasons I believe that we are facing one of those critical moments in history when Columbus has reemerged as important. It's a moment where we see demagoguery happening. We see battles over the textbooks of our children, right? Those clinging to the values codified in whiteness, the ones that Columbus represents on the national altar of meaning, have called for another civil war. This is not a battle over taxes or regulation or the environment or states' rights. That's just technical veneer. And we don't have a technical problem. We have an identity problem. And this can't be solved with a technical solution. The technical problems can be so onerous and kind of sexy that we are constantly spending our time fighting them, but they will never go away until we solve the identity problem. There is a battle over our identity here. Who are we, really? So this weekend, I recognize the Day of the People, a people forged in great trauma and great love. We all have our work to do if we want to be free. But it doesn't all look the same, right? People who look like me, who carry the whiteness, must take purity off the altar and replace it with emancipation. Our own emancipation from the chain we put on ourselves. And this won't be easy. But whiteness is destroying us all. So I pray this weekend that you will choose the death of whiteness, and in doing so, choose life for yourself and for the rest of our family. in this nation that I love.